gentleman addressed a young woman by the name of Edith. He had not intended for everything to transpire in this manner, yet he had pledged to expedite the proceedings, minimizing physical contact to the greatest extent possible. Regrettably, there was no alternative now. Consequently, he extended his apologies to the young lady and resumed his tasks. The young woman, unable to suppress her astonishment, brought her hand to her mouth. How had it come to this? There was nothing extraordinary about this day. A month prior, Edith had been engrossed in her work in her office when she was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was the butler, Sever. Edith inquired how she could be of assistance. Sever served as the butler to Marquess Rodion. The butler informed her that he wished to discuss the procurement of insulation materials. Edith Argyle, the financier of Marquess Rodion. Sever had heard through the grapevine that complications might arise, resulting in significantly reduced quantities compared to the previous year. Edith inquired as to the reason. She had already made the initial installment on the deferred payment. The butler then responded that apparently something had gone awry. They were even prepared to pay a penalty equal to 30% of the sum. Edith folded her hands, pondering if this would resolve the situation. They had dared to deceive her in this manner. After all, she held a position of considerable importance. Edith, with a determined demeanor, asserted that it seemed the volume of materials had somewhat diminished, as if someone had misappropriated a portion for their own gain. Goodness, what was she to make of this? The staff and those in her employ believed that she was far from vulnerable. The butler then approached her, stating that Lady Argyle would not retreat without a fight. However, she merely responded with a wry smile. Perhaps, if they promised to reduce their fine, they might be able to assist in finding an alternative supplier for the missing materials. The butler acknowledged that this would undoubtedly ease Lady's workload, and he would reach out to the company. Subsequently, he seemed to notice something and inquired of Lady Argyle if something was amiss. She emerged from her reverie, inquiring about his meaning. The butler then casually mentioned that he had simply thought that Lady Argyle appeared deep in thought, but she assured him that nothing was amiss. She simply couldn't comprehend how she had been entrusted with such responsibilities. After all, she made life easier for the Marquess, didn't she? But she was merely the Marquess's financial steward. It all seemed a bit much for her. The butler then asked why that was the case. Had someone been unkind to her? She assured him that it was not the case. In essence, she played the roles of both a wife and a household manager. The Marquess was currently absent, but she had never considered herself entitled to undertake such duties. However, at that moment, the Marquess entered her office. Leaning against the door, he crossed his arms and stated that he considered himself fortunate to have Edith. The young woman was somewhat taken aback, and he remarked that she seemed to be not very busy. Alpheus Rodion, the master of Silver Glen Fortress. He went on to say that, judging by their relationship, it amounted to nothing. Then, those in the room noticed that it appeared the Marquess was in a foul mood. Edith, scratching her head uncertainly, said that they had already concluded their business. The Marquess replied that it was just as well, for they would have had to interrupt in any case. The butler mentioned that he had many duties to attend to and was preparing to leave, but the Marquess then inquired why he was still in the office, and the butler swiftly departed. Edith then invited the Marquess to take a seat, but he mentioned that he wouldn't be staying long. When the young woman attempted to assure him that she was listening attentively, he approached her. He leaned in far too closely. He continued to question why, and Edith could not fathom what he meant. The Marquess then inquired whether Edith was married. Without giving the young woman a chance to gather her thoughts, he posed a second question, whether she intended to seek a husband. It was known, however, that she had no intention of doing so. After all, the men around her, her colleagues, and the butler certainly did not fit the bill. They had grown up together, after all. The second was like a brother to her. Petty aristocrats, miserly individuals, and fools. Then there was the Marquess, the sole potential candidate. He was presently searching for his younger brother to force him into marriage in his stead. Truth be told, she had no interest in love anymore. Seeing the confusion on the young woman's face, the Marquess proposed that she simply agree if he was correct. She responded with agreement. Then, leaning in even closer, Rodion asked if Edith could pretend to be his fiancée. Edith was utterly astonished. Edith and the woman enjoyed a cup of tea together. The woman inquired as to where she could find the Marquess. Their separation had endured for 12 long years, and she longed to reunite with him. However, Edith found herself at a loss for words. Her face was on the verge of cracking from her forced smile. Moreover, her dress made it difficult for her to breathe. The young woman had assumed the role of the mistress of Silver Glen Fortress, and the Marquess had promised her a tenfold increase in her salary as a bonus. It was too enticing to decline. Devil, if not for the money, she would have never agreed to partake in such a scheme. Galloway, the sole daughter of the Duke, gazed at the woman before her. Their lineage had thrived for 3 generations, and the current young lady was the embodiment of beauty. To be such a coveted bride and have to beg for a marriage. The Galloway family was maddening. They had broken off the engagement themselves, boasted of the antiquity of their lineage, and now wanted to marry off their daughter again. They had simply changed their minds when they caught wind of the rumors about the Alfios family's connection to the widowed queen. Edith attempted to calm the Marquess. It may have sounded impertinent, but he could simply marry Viola and secure Galloway for himself. However, the Marquess looked at his subordinate with displeasure and asked her to repeat herself. She declined, as repeating such words to the Duke was perilous. Thus, she had to meet with the Countess. The young woman tried to bolster her spirits, for she could do this for the sake of a substantial salary and bonuses. Edith replied to Viola that the Marquess had gone to inspect his holdings. The young woman was surprised and inquired if the Marquess had left the estate. Edith agreed and informed her that his lordship would return in a few days. Viola was dissatisfied. Last week, she had sent a letter notifying them of her imminent visit. Perhaps there had been an error in the date. However, Edith stated that they had received the letter, but Viola could not comprehend why. Rodion had left. Edith stated that she had personally witnessed the envelope being opened, and it seemed that Viola understood. The contents of correspondence between aristocrats were always kept secret from subordinates. In other words, when the realization struck Viola, she smiled and requested Edith to introduce herself, and the young woman then conveyed her name. Upon hearing it, Viola stated that Argyle was a vassalage of Rodion, the Viscount's house of Rodion. The young woman concurred, saying that her brother was indeed Viscount Argyle. She often practiced introducing herself, but it remained a challenging endeavor. Understandably so, for Edith Argyle was far too humble for the Marquess. She felt a tad uncomfortable introducing herself, but one couldn't perpetually avoid it. She had to say it. With a smile, the young woman introduced herself to Viola and stated that she was engaged to his lordship. However, taking her teacup, Viola requested her forgiveness but admitted that she had not heard news of the Marquess's engagement. Edith, undeterred, smiled and said that, of course, they could not have known about it. After all, Lady Galloway was well informed regarding the current complex situation, even without her assistance. Therefore, the Marquess would act accordingly and announce the engagement as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Viola, the Marquess's cousin and Queen Grisela's daughter, Princess Regina. After she dealt with her younger stepsister, Tricia, Viola had unofficially been regarded as the heir to the throne. However, the coronation was not in the immediate future, so Regina decided to strip Tricia of her rights to the throne entirely and become the sole heiress. But the Galloways supported the candidacy of the younger sister, so they found themselves in a rather precarious situation at the moment. Then, with a smile, Edith inquired of Viola what else she wished to know. She could inquire without reservation. But Viola haughtily stated that she was grateful for the hospitality, but that was all. She desired some rest. Edith ordered Lady Galloway to be escorted to the guest chambers. 4 days later, Lady Viola had not left the Marquess's estate. She conducted herself there as if she were at home. Each day was exceedingly arduous for Edith, but the Marquess was no ordinary man. He had convened a meeting immediately upon his arrival, without even welcoming Lady Galloway, and this audacious woman patiently awaited him. Well, his lordship mentioned that he had a business meeting with a feudal lord. Apparently, even such high-ranking aristocrats would not want to risk their reputation by interrupting an important meeting. With his arms crossed over his chest, the Marquess requested that they be informed of everything transpiring here, except concerning the aforementioned guest. If those gathered at the meeting had no reports, something would have to be concocted, and preferably more than one thing. By the way, even if Viola looked down on everyone, how dared she speak about the well-being of the fortress? When the other topics had been exhausted, Rodion turned his attention to the finances. However, under Edith's precise guidance, everything was proceeding as it should. She worked impeccably. She began. As everyone is well aware, the young lady is involved in a certain scheme. When everyone inquired what was meant by a scheme, she asked them not to dwell on the term. But in any case, how could she think about anything else? Then the Marquess asked what Lady Galloway had done to Edith, and the young woman said that an entire day wouldn't suffice to read out all of Lady Galloway's transgressions. But as the most devoted financier of the Marquess, she asked for only one thing. She beseeched them to evict Viola as soon as possible. Then the head of the knights, Dart, asked if Viola had struck Edith. However, the head of the Uter administration replied to Dart not to exaggerate. Meanwhile, Barigan's servant inquired if they were speaking of the same haughty Lady Viola. All those present began conversing amongst themselves. From the expression on the guest's face, it was evident that she was on the verge of draining them of all their life. Others questioned Edith about why she was staying so quickly. Since she had begun, she needed to see it through to the end. Morrow's servant supported the last speaker, but Edith felt uneasy. It was easy to ruminate in such a manner when you are merely an observer. The Duke asked if she hadn't accepted this position herself, in addition to the promised payments. From Edith's observations, the Marquess, though obstinate, was logical and fair. Therefore, if she were to ask, he would undoubtedly grant her request. And the young woman stated that, regrettably, her skills were insufficient for such work. The man always agreed when asked, and if she did so sincerely, he would surely comply. So, she asked him to annul the engagement. However, to her surprise, the Marquess refused this time. Edith had thought that the Marquess would agree to annul the engagement, but he promptly declined. The young lady couldn't fathom why he had made such a decision. However, the Marquess, with a wry smile, responded that when he said no, he meant it. He then requested everyone present at the meeting to leave. Edith was very nervous. She found herself in a difficult predicament. Lady Viola, wearing a smile, sat across from the Earl, sipping her tea, remarking that it had been quite some time since their last meeting. She introduced herself, and Alpheus did the same. He had never imagined he would see Viola again. It was regrettable that their reunion had occurred under such circumstances. Smiling, Viola mentioned that Lady Argyle had hospitably cared for her in the Marquess's absence. It must have been a heavy burden on Edith after everything she had endured, especially now as the mistress of the estate. Viola felt a twinge of guilt, but then, with a smile, she commented that she seemed to be talking too much, all because of her unfortunate visit to the capital. Rodion, looking at Edith, remarked that since Viola's father had insisted on this, no one should deny him, even now. Observing this atmosphere, Edith felt somewhat uneasy. The Marquess continued, stating that Lady Viola, who had come to such a remote place, was more famous than her father. The girl had endeavored to behave as modestly and affably as possible, but Rodion had rattled her composure, and Viola's self-restraint had become a thing of the past. Finally, the Marquess suggested that they adjourn since it was apparent that Viola couldn't think clearly due to her anger. After a brief conversation, Lady Viola mentioned that she would retire to her assigned room. She bid the Marquess farewell. Meanwhile, Edith pondered that everything seemed much simpler than she had thought. However, after noticing Viola's exceedingly hostile look, she feared that something unpleasant might be looming. The Duke sat there, sifting through papers. As soon as Edith had the urge to go to tea with Viola instead of him, the Marquess inquired about the source of this sudden eagerness. Edith then mentioned that someone had refused to alter the deal, so she would need to continue working under the same terms. Seeing the venomous expression on her face, even a foolish person might have harbored suspicions. If that were the case, Viola might genuinely make a misstep during her next encounter with the Marquess. The Marquess instructed Edith to do as she wished, but advised her not to delve too deeply into it. Edith acknowledged his words, though in retrospect, it would have been wiser to heed his advice. During her tea with Viola, the latter inquired whether this meant that his lordship, the Marquess, couldn't attend. Edith responded sadly that, indeed, it had turned out that way. Viola took some medication, which greatly surprised Edith, who remained unaware of what lay ahead. She soon lost consciousness, and upon awakening, she noticed that Viola and her maid had gone. She then felt rather peculiar. At that moment, Rodion approached her and saw her unusual condition. When the young woman regained consciousness, the first person her eyes met was the Marquess. He explained that many had seen Edith as they walked to his room. More than 2 hours had passed since their last encounter, and the Marquess had decided to check in and ensure everything was all right. He then asked Edith what had happened. Edith replied that Lady Galloway had slipped something into her tea. At first, the Duke believed it was merely a sedative. However, upon seeing Edith's condition, he realized that it had a more lasting effect and decided to alleviate her suffering with a specific remedy. Edith lay on the bed, trembling, as the Duke assuaged her desires, helping her relieve the tension from the drink she had recently consumed. However, the Duke noticed that using just his fingers was insufficient and strained considerably. The young lady was still far from climax, but the Duke had mysophobia. He sighed and, then spreading the girl's legs further, He said he would help her, so she needed to endure a bit longer. He resolved to perform cunnilingus. The girl's moans echoed through the room, and she involuntarily grasped the Duke by the hair. She was entirely incapable of coherent thought. The Duke, stepping back, pondered whether one round was inadequate given the potency of the substance. The girl reached out, saying that she still wanted more. She looked incredibly seductive in that moment, and the Duke, accepting her hand, lightly bit her finger, remarking that she better remain silent rather than speak such things. He removed his gloves for the first time in a long while, then proceeded to caress the girl with his fingers. It felt somewhat unfamiliar to her due to the intensity of her emotions, and she couldn't stifle her moans. Once it was over, Rodion took a glass of water, thinking that thankfully the girl was feeling better. He glanced at his fingers and grimaced. Afterward, he told Edith that if she needed clothing, she could wear his jacket. Then he left her alone. The young lady was greatly shocked by the recent events, and she hoped fervently that it was all just a dream. One could only dream. The following day, Lady Galloway was absent from the estate, a discovery made by the chambermaid who had come to assist with Edith's morning routine. Edith then realized that Viola had departed without a word. In light of everything that had transpired, it was apparent that Marquess Rodion should have been Viola's target yesterday. However, it was Edith who had taken the initiative. Had she abandoned that endeavor, nothing would have occurred. Nevertheless, someone had still tampered with the potion. How could a lady of such prominence in the capital behave so deplorably? Edith then inquired of the chambermaid if Viola had been in her room the previous evening, or if the maid had noticed anything unusual. The chambermaid replied that Viola had declined her services, so the girl couldn't have entered the chamber. Edith asked if anything might have been overheard. The chambermaid mentioned that she heard Viola speaking with her maid. The Marquess had spent a long time with Lady Argyle, which had troubled Viola at the time. That conversation appeared to revolve around the fact that Lady Argyle was indeed the Marquess's fiancée since he was assisting her with her ailment. On that occasion, the Duke's daughter had done most of the talking. These were just fragments of information, but even so, it was evident that the guest had two objectives. First, to consume an aphrodisiac in conjunction with the Marquess to prevent an irreversible outcome. Second, to ascertain if Edith Argyle was truly his lordship's fiancée. Edith, heaving a sigh, remarked that the Duke's daughter, Viola, was genuinely a dreadful woman. Then, the chambermaid became flustered and asked Edith to recount the events of the previous day involving the Duke. However, noticing Edith's terrifying gaze, the chambermaid, embarrassed, fled. Edith, with tears in her eyes, wondered if everyone in the estate knew. She feared that she might go mad. Edith awoke early in the morning, her mind teeming with questions. How? Why? For what reason? Could it be that everyone already knows about what transpired yesterday between her and the Marquess? At that moment, the chambermaids and footmen bore skeptical, enigmatic smiles. Edith found herself devoid of the means to explain herself to anyone. How could she possibly look anyone in the eye? And what of the Marquess? Rising from her bed, the young lady pondered that she must leave. She had begun gathering her belongings, caring not for the consequences. But how had others learned of the events that had transpired? In Viscount Argyle's estate, presided over by Thuron Argyle, the head of the household, he encountered his sister. The girl observed her brother, who appeared drowsy, and inquired when he had become the head of the family, wondering if he now slumbered for entire days. Her brother responded that he was on vacation and requested her to allow him to rest. It had been 2 days since Edith had taken a day off in 6 years, so a bit of respite wouldn't hurt, but to arrive unannounced was rather. How would she then return to the Marquess? But could she even do so? She was consumed by fear and loneliness. Edith read the tale of escape from reality to a little girl, which was Lady Argyle's intoxication. The young girl asked if the princess of the story now lived in the prince's castle, and inquired about her kingdom's fate. The girl was Sophia Argyle, a member of the Argyle family. Edith replied that the princess had a younger brother who would soon become king. She herself could have become a queen before, but since she was now married, Sophia then inquired why she hadn't become a queen. After all, a princess could. Their kingdom had a queen. She could have as well. Edith responded that the book she had read was indeed quite peculiar, so the girl asked if she wanted to hear the story of Her Majesty. Sophia inquired again, is the Marquess she lives with as handsome as the king, and is the queen as beautiful? Then Edith replied that most likely, although she hadn't seen the queen in person, so she couldn't be certain. It would be wonderful if the queen also had silvery hair. The little girl mentioned seeing a drawing of the crown. Edith left Sophia's room and contemplated that she was quite exhausted, though she had fewer responsibilities than usual. There was undoubtedly more work to be done in Silverwood Grove due to her sudden departure. The financiers were likely disarrayed, and they already had so few staff members. She mentally apologized. She wondered what the Marquess would say. He would certainly bring up the topic concerning the Duke's daughter. But how would they react to her revelations about the attempted poisoning? Would he be furious? Would he disbelieve her? Burst into laughter right in her face? What should she do now? If only she could forget what had occurred. Between her and the Marquess, there had existed the typical professional interaction between an employer and an employee. What she had once felt for this man had remained hidden in the depths of her heart. All this time, she had simply been the loyal servant of the Marquess, but this could no longer persist. Would Edith Argyle truly remain a non-entity? Edith beseeched the preservation of her narrative's confidentiality from her sibling. Rose acquiesced, yet Edith interjected, expressing her gratitude for her audience, but signaling the termination of today's discourse. As Viscount Argyle made ready to depart, he bid farewell to his spouse and daughter. However, he discerned a spectral apparition proximate to a tree, bearing an uncanny resemblance to his sister. Edith conjectured that her brother was parting ways with her. He approached her for a valediction. The Viscount was astounded by the state of his sister. Could it truly be her? Subsequently, Rose inquired of Thuron the veracity of their rumored noonday specter. Urgently, she summoned her husband to leave, and Sophia observed that her aunt indeed bore an ethereal visage. She approached the young woman and questioned if anyone had inquired about her well-being. Accordingly, the girl resolved to pose the query herself. She inquired if all was well with Edith, and the maiden candidly responded that things were far from amicable. The Lord of Silvergrove, Marquess Alpheus Carlyle Rodion, was solicited by Edith to endorse her entreaty for personal arrangements. She composed a letter, presuming that he was already apprised of her situation and, hence, no detailed exposition was requisite. While she continued penning her missive, someone vociferously beckoned her, eliciting her trepidation. The voice belonged to Marquess Alpheus, who roamed the estate, vociferating and in search of her. Servants endeavored to impede his progress, but were unable to do so. Edith realized that he was in close proximity based on the sound and that she could not elude him. What recourse did she have? A servant suggested that if the Marquess would wait in the drawing room, he would personally escort Lady Edith. Nonetheless, the Marquess demurred, asserting that the servant had just claimed not to know her whereabouts. The Marquess was loath to squander precious time. Rodion flung open the door and entered the Viscount's study. He was accosted, yet he failed to spot Edith in the study and continued his scrutiny. The young woman, concealed beneath the table, ruminated that her concealment had scarcely succeeded. Subsequently, she noted the man advancing directly toward her. Given her revelation, there was no further impetus to remain hidden. Observing the young lady emerging from her covert, the Marquess inquired, with astonishment, if she had been there all along. She, in turn, was taken aback. Apparently, he was unaware of her presence under the table. When she made preparations to depart, the Marquess grasped her hand, inquiring about her destination. She felt disconcerted, recalling his previous actions with his fingers, and implored him to release her. However, he refused, fearing her potential escape. Edith informed Alpheus that he was well aware of why she acted as she did. Nonetheless, he demurred, professing absolute ignorance of the reasons behind her silent withdrawal. At that juncture, the young lady could no longer contain herself and inquired if explanations were required under such circumstances. The Marquess regarded her with a questioning gaze. Why had she fled so precipitously? Edith was intrigued. Was the Marquess inquiring because he genuinely did not know? He confirmed as much. That was why he had come in person. Or would Edith prefer his subordinate's attendance instead of him? Edith Argyle abruptly decided to resign from her employment, a most unusual step for her. The question arose, what were her customary occupations? She apologized, recognizing that the Marquess had been compelled to embark on a lengthy journey on her account. She had not anticipated that he would personally come for her. Nevertheless, it proved convenient. She had intended to dispatch a messenger to the estate, but since the letter's recipient had arrived in person, it was effortless to hand over the parcel. The young woman retrieved the letter, freshly scribed, and presented it to the Marquess. After perusing its contents, he smiled and remarked that it was hardly humorous. He forbade her resignation. She retorted that her departure was clearly stipulated in the letter. He vehemently objected. In response, Edith declared that he could not forcibly remove her from the study. Alpheus inquired if she was indeed resolute about relinquishing her role as a financier. The young woman surmised that the Marquess had reconciled with her departure and acquiesced. Upon hearing her response, the Marquess lifted her effortlessly, placing her on his shoulder as if she were a sack of potatoes, and with a smirk declared that now, since she was no longer his financier, he would treat her accordingly. Upon the young lady's return to the Silver Grove, the entire retinue exhibited a degree of agitation and extended their salutations. They had been somewhat disconcerted when she vanished without uttering a word, and even the Marquess himself had been unnerved. Edith then chuckled and declared that the chambermaid need not apologize, but rather she was weary and in need of repose. The maid offered her apologies and instructed Edith to rest, promising to summon the chambermaid should her services be required. Nevertheless, Edith clarified that she had been misunderstood. Edith sought to exit the room, but the chambermaid promptly nipped those intentions in the bud. She had been explicitly instructed not to let Edith leave. With an effervescent smile directed towards her newfound mistress, the chambermaid conveyed her intention to leave and proposed that Edith engage in further discourse later. Observing the room to which she had been escorted, the young lady discerned that it was not her chamber at all. She had been told to merely rest, but in fact, she had been subjected to house arrest. The surroundings refrained from providing answers, but the Marquess's actions seemed to convey a message. She was not to take a step outside. Moreover, this was the Marquess's own chamber. Thus, where was Edith to recline? Alpheus's mother had passed away at an early age. These quarters had been occupied by the Marquess's wives from one generation to the next, maintaining order and cleanliness even when unoccupied for the past 2 decades. It was hardly surprising that shivers coursed down her spine, especially concerning the bed. However, Edith was fatigued due to the day's tumultuous events. In a sense, she had been taken captive, and the Marquess, his lordship, had simply departed on some pressing matter. Such weariness suddenly overwhelmed her. She hadn't anticipated the Marquess to conclude his business so swiftly. Thus, she opted to partake in a brief respite. Rodion inquired about Edith's well-being, but he was informed that the young lady had not summoned anyone after dismissing the chambermaid. Approaching the chamber's door, Alpheus knocked, announcing his presence. Silence reigned within. When he received no response, he took it upon himself to open the door without permission. Noticing Edith's absence from the bed, he initially assumed she had fled and furrowed his brow in concern. However, he soon spotted Edith slumbering on the divan. Edith Argyle, the very reason behind the Marquess's stable life, and at times, his impulsive actions averted. The young woman opened her eyes and was taken aback to see the Marquess standing above her. With a smile, the Marquess inquired why she chose to sleep on the divan rather than the bed. Edith replied that she couldn't bring herself to do so. This response left Rodion surprised. Was the bed not designed for slumber? Edith explained that perhaps he had forgotten, but these were the chambers of the mistress of the Silver Grove, and she couldn't linger there. Alpheus retorted that, with his permission, she could even dance naked through the room if she so wished. But Edith had no inclination for such activities. The Marquess then inquired why not. If something about the room did not meet her approval, it could be altered. Initially, Edith inquired how much such a transformation would cost. However, upon reflection, she questioned why she should renovate the room herself. Alpheus asked if anything would change if she were to reside in the Marquess's chambers instead. Edith replied that she had her own room. Alpheus ordered the servants to tidy it up, as she had resigned from her role as a financier. There was no mention of her betrothal. Consequently, these were her new quarters. Edith was taken aback. The Duke's daughter had indeed departed. Why, then? She did not wish to continue playing the role of his fiancé. The Marquess reminded her that the annulment of their engagement had to be mutual. Had she forgotten? Edith sighed. She could not feel at ease in this room, and the reason was well known to him. However, he appeared somewhat nervous and asked whether this had been her first experience with medical assistance. Nonetheless, no one in the estate was aware that she had been drugged. Nevertheless, rumors regarding their intimacy were circulating, based on the strength of her constitution. Consequently, would it not be preferable to refrain from annulment? Edith, shielding her eyes, remarked that this would alter nothing, for the past was irrevocable. The Marquess then wished to propose that they pretend that nothing had transpired. However, he halted himself. First and foremost, he intended to rectify the situation and provide her with all necessary support. Edith had no need for such sympathy. She believed it best to annul their engagement forthwith. The Marquess inquired whether he was so repugnant to her. She countered that he ought to pose that question, for he was the one who held her in less regard. Hearing her words, the Marquess winced. What? She proceeded to ask why, if that were not the case, he had simply departed on that fateful day. Alpheus interjected, simply departed. Edith continued, asserting that, unlike her, Rodion had been in his right mind that day. Yet, his comments about medical assistance left her shocked. Rodion requested that Edith wait, but she halted him, stating that he should seek out a woman with whom he wished to share his bed and engage in a true betrothal. Alpheus then inquired whether he would propose to Edith for marriage if he did not harbor any sexual attraction toward her. What purpose, then, would it serve? But he abruptly ceased, stating that he had misspoken. This was not something that could be explained through words. He needed to ascertain whether he did indeed harbor such feelings for her. The Marquess raised the young woman's chin and leaned in closely, leaving her deeply perturbed. Edith was so profoundly astonished that she could scarcely believe the recent utterances of the Marquis. She trembled and harbored a desire to escape. Yet, the Marquis once again detained her, compelling her to recline upon the divan, looming over her. He remarked upon the girl's remarkable forgetfulness, but she inquired as to the subject of his discourse. Taking her hand, he pressed it against his own midriff, asserting that it would be most judicious for her to ascertain for herself the effect she had on him. The young lady emitted a resounding gasp, taken aback by the unexpected turn of events. The Marquis, slightly discomfited, then remarked that he had not yet attained full rigidity, and had not managed to engorge himself completely, compared to that day. Recollecting that fateful day, Edith found herself even more disconcerted, unconsciously clenching her hand against Rodian's groin, which elicited a muffled groan from him. He suggested that they ought to proceed in a more orderly manner. In response, Edith inquired, in what manner? The Marquis seized her hands with one of his own, pressing them against the bed above Edith's head. He lamented the terrible misunderstanding that had occurred, apparently due to the absence of their usual routine. Nevertheless, this time, all would transpire as it should. First and foremost, a kiss shall ensue. The Marquis inclined toward the maiden and tenderly pressed his lips to hers. After a brief and fervent kiss, he moistly trailed the tip of his tongue to her ear, and gradually commenced the process of liberating her from her attire. The young lady attempted to thwart his advances, yet he remained heedless of her entreaties. Overwhelmed by profound embarrassment, she involuntarily clasped her legs and pressed her lips together. In that moment, the Marquis declared that if the maiden had anything to articulate, she should express it, for he would soon find himself incapable of restraint. However, Edith was astonished. Could it be that he displayed such restraint now, after divesting her of her garments and teasing her lips? The Marquis further explained that if he spoke something awry that displeased the maiden, she had a means to halt him. She simply needed to administer a resounding slap and deliver a forceful kick in a certain place, and he would immediately desist. He informed Edith that the most effective defense lay in a well-executed offense, and now she was familiar with the precise target. Did she still require additional time for contemplation? However, the maiden attempted to voice her dissent, but how could she? In response, the Marquis remarked that indeed, such conduct was unbecoming of a financier. Nevertheless, what of the bride-to-be? If that were her current designation, silence descended upon the room. If the maiden had chosen to engage in a game of silence, it was an ill-conceived notion. The young lady implored him to desist, but he, withdrawing for a moment, declared that if she wished to cease, she merely had to strike him. However, the maiden asserted that the Marquis knew well that she could not bring herself to do so. Therefore, her only course was to obediently yield to him. The Marquis lifted the maiden into his arms, and when she felt herself descending, she clung to him, holding him tightly with her arms and legs. Rodian praised her intelligence and laid her upon the bed. On that day, he concluded that he had lost his sanity, but he could not refrain from assisting in such a circumstance. Edith's consciousness was so befuddled that she scarcely noticed him. Nevertheless, he acted correctly. At that time, it was the sole right decision. This time, the maiden was reasoning lucidly, which meant her sensations ought to be distinct. When he withdrew, the maiden closed her legs and became deeply disconcerted, attempting to shield herself. Subsequently, the Marquis divested himself of his clothing, asserting that now they could proceed to the main event. Upon beholding the unclothed gentleman, Edith pondered that she had no prior conception of what the quintessential visage entailed. A profound disquiet consumed her as she laid eyes upon the concealed enigma beneath Rodian's undergarments. The man ascended to her bedside, and a profound discomfiture besieged the maiden. She contemplated what the ensuing moments would unfurl, lowering her gaze once more to the gentleman's loins. At close quarters, he appeared even more disquieting to her. Yet, she did not even graze his form, so why was he so? Then, Alpheus conveyed that she need not continue to gaze, merely beckoning her to touch him once more. She harbored the inclination to decline, but the Marquis, taking her hand, pressed it against his groin, asserting that it would be preferable for her to ascertain her own influence over him. And thus, the young lady found herself in a state of disconcertment, as it seemed she had already ascertained that influence. She wished to voice something to the Marquis, but he commenced moving her hand, and averred that he hoped this would serve as corroborative testimony. Edith wished to conclude matters at this juncture, but the Marquis inclined toward her ear and whispered that there was no need to restrain themselves any longer, once again sealing his lips with hers. He caressed the maiden's form, showering it with kisses, reenacting the same scenario as that day when they had imbibed the aphrodisiac, albeit the sensations within Edith were utterly distinct, and she could not fathom the reason for such disparity. Parting the young lady's legs, the gentleman positioned himself between them and fully engaged, casting aside the veil that concealed his betrothed's countenance. He remarked that it would be more pleasant without pain, yet it was inescapable. Upon perceiving tears welling in Edith's eyes, he tendered his apologies for the discomfort he had caused, but subsequently, he smiled, endearing himself greatly to Edith. He began to move within the maiden at a leisurely pace, endowing her with unforgettable sensations. It was an impossibility, but the radiant gaze of Rodion, fixated upon Lady Argyle, evoked a singular emotion. Edith harbored clandestine fantasies about him, yet ultimately capitulated, for it was indeed love. Presently, the Marquis and Edith resolved to converse regarding the day when Edith Argyle and Alpheus Rodion first crossed paths. Seated amidst his affairs, the Marquis was apprised by the butler that the Viscount Argyle's younger sister had submitted an application for the position of a financial analyst. The butler inquired what his master wished of him. After perusing the missive, Rodion declared that the financial department was currently suffering from an insufficient workforce, and thus the maiden would be most opportune. He resolved to admit her as an intern, though she arrived as a very youthful lady of a mere 19 years. In her defense, he could only assert that he was but a year her senior. Hence, it was hardly surprising that the notion of the intern's age did not cross his mind. The Marquis proposed that the young lady return in a couple or a few years, but she resolutely stiffened her resolve and began enumerating the reasons why she should not be dismissed. The labor force was excessively meager in comparison to the demand, and the financiers were excessively overburdened. At this rate, they might expire prematurely, succumbing to the workload. Listening to all of this, the Marquis was deeply disquieted. He found Edith to be a peculiar individual in many respects. It vexed him, yet she had never spoken an untruth. Consequently, he acquiesced to her desires. He was both tormented and, simultaneously, admiring of Edith's bravery, which enabled her to defy him. That was the extent of it. However, he became infatuated with her after that. When she smiled at him, he was disoriented for the first time, as though he had spent his entire life in a desert and suddenly found himself in a magnificent garden at the moment the flowers were in full bloom. He fell in love with the energy that Edith exuded, although he had experienced such a sentiment only once before. Thus, he had no inkling of what would transpire next. Hence, as he endeavored to select the precise words to convey his sentiments, he unwittingly committed a multitude of errors. When Edith inquired if he were married, he responded that he had no intention of marrying. At that point, Edith asked how the man intended to address the matter of inheriting the title. Rodion rejoined that he could pass it to his younger brother. Nevertheless, Edith disclosed that his younger brother was on the run, and Rodion stated that he could retrieve him at any moment. From the very first day of his absence, he was well aware of his whereabouts and activities. To effect his return, Rodion need only lift a finger. Edith was the first to assert her disinclination to wed, so he resolved to follow suit. He postponed this notion as he began to conceal his hands. When Edith inquired why the Marquis consistently wore gloves of late, he replied that he disliked touching soiled objects. The young lady pondered that this implied that she too was unclean, as were other people. However, in truth, Rodion was consumed by passion whenever Edith's hands accidentally brushed against his own. Therefore, gloves became an integral part of his life from that moment onward. Nevertheless, he could not confess this shamelessly. After concealing his emotions for years, he harbored the belief that all would return to normal with the passage of time. However, when Edith suggested he consider Viola Galloway as his betrothed, he became exceedingly incensed, as it was solely for this reason that he had persuaded her to assume the role of a faux bride. He devised numerous justifications for her continued impersonation. To be sure, there were many inconsistencies, but she did not even take note of them. In reality, Rodion had no intentions of advancing beyond this charade. He did not dare to contemplate the words and actions that ordinarily transpired between lovers. But did he desire too much? Everything had grown exceedingly convoluted. Rational thinking had become impossible. Nevertheless, he did not want matters to deteriorate further, so he aided the maiden in resolving the issue with the aphrodisiac. When she had fallen asleep, Rodion inquired if she would comprehend that he had fallen ill the following day due to his strenuous efforts to restrain himself in her presence. Following this incident, she would undoubtedly flee, for she consistently uttered things that exasperated him. He hoped that Edith would now apprehend the charm she held for him. When Edith opened her eyes, she let out a panicked cry and sat up abruptly, yet she was racked by the pain from the consequences of the previous night. However, a bit later, she noticed that she was wearing a new nightgown, one she had never owned. It was the first time she had laid eyes on it, and the fabric was of exquisite quality, as if it had been laundered before being dressed. Subsequently, she recollected what had transpired with the Marquis, and realized that he had washed and dressed her. At that moment, a chambermaid entered the room and inquired if Edith had slept well. The chambermaid smiled and asked for permission to assist Edith in bathing and dressing. Edith, closing her eyes in pleasure, hadn't expected that she would receive help even with her coiffure. Her thoughts were interrupted by a young woman's exuberant voice, one who marveled at the grooming accessories sent by the Marquis. They were remarkably expensive and beautiful. The young woman was admiring a ribbon in the chambermaid's hand, seemingly of the finest quality. Edith noted that the chambermaid spoke more than she had ever heard her speak before. With eyes like a kitten's, the young woman asked Edith for permission to help style her hair. It appeared that the chambermaid was delighted, as such opulent items were rarely seen in their estate. In the Silver Grove, high-ranking aristocrats did not possess an abundance of luxury items. Perhaps the expenditures were minimal, as such trifles were of no interest to anyone. But this led many to believe that the Rodian family's downfall was imminent. Though the primary reason was the future Marquess, or rather, her absence. His lordship's mother had already passed away, and Griselda, the last lady of the family, had become queen. Hence, the maids who dreamt of living the life of a noble lady found their days tedious at the estate. When the chambermaid had finished styling Edith's hair, the young lady complimented her, for she appeared rather presentable, and she thought of the Marquis. At that moment, he entered their room and stated that if the chambermaid had finished, she could depart. Edith tensed. The Marquis approached the young lady, taking her hand and kissing the back of it. He then raised his gaze to meet her eyes. She, feeling somewhat abashed, wondered if Rodian had just kissed her hand. After the kiss, the Marquis remarked that they should also work on her greeting. When the young lady failed to comprehend what he meant, he stated that she should address him by his given name and bestowed a charming smile upon her. Upon inquiring why she should do so, the Marquis explained that there was a reason for it, for Edith was now his betrothed. The young lady, once more, requested that he relieve her of the status of his betrothed. When the Marquis wanted to mention the contract, the young lady stated that it was no longer valid, for the contract had been signed when she served as the Marquis's financial analyst. Edith thought that pretending not to care about all of this was easy, but she needed to conclude it as swiftly as possible, for it was too perilous. Fragments of her heart no longer belonged to her, so she needed to end it. Put an end to it even before her heart realized what had occurred, before it could be hurt. She beseeched the Marquis to release her, as there was nothing between them. But they had spent a night together, and it could impact her future. So, he needed to make amends. The young lady asserted that she did not desire this. She had never wished to get married, after all. Thus, if he intended to atone for his actions, he should refrain from doing so, lest she take it as an offense. Then the Marquis inquired whether, if he were to reinstate her in her former position, the contract would remain in effect, or if she merely wished to work for him. Edith thought that the Marquis was pushing it, but she wanted to put an end to it. The Queen was in the midst of composing a missive to the Marquis. She had been apprised of his betrothal. No doubt, due to the tumultuous affairs in the capital, he refrained from troubling his aunt with elaborate details. However, as a member of the Rodian family, she could not simply turn a blind eye to it. Now that the throne was finally occupied, and tranquility prevailed in the capital, the Queen was eager to visit Marquis Rodian as expeditiously as possible to discuss the impending nuptials. She beseeched the Marquis not to prepare a reception for her arrival. Just await her. This was a missive born of affection, penned by Griselda Helen Rodian Dunkeld. Having perused it, Alpheus sighed and furrowed his brow slightly. He could scarcely believe that the Queen had resolved to come in person. Clearly, this decision was part and parcel of Viola Galavi's and the Duke's plan. Princess Regina, the daughter of the widowed queen, had ascended the throne. Yet, the Galavi lineage could not be utterly obliterated. Thus, negotiations had been initiated between the families of the Duke and the Marquis, culminating in a decision for a matrimonial alliance. Nonetheless, the Marquis had severed this betrothal. The Galavis had essentially brought this upon themselves, and now, instead of conceding, they had chosen to employ Griselda to exert pressure upon him. How dare they? Alpheus, while scratching his temple, expressed his gratitude to Edith for understanding his predicament. She replied that there was no alternative, but the Marquis asserted that engaging in a dialogue with the former ruler would be a formidable challenge. Sighing, Edith stated her readiness for it, assuring him that it was all in order. She pondered, could the queen be more formidable than his lordship Alpheus? Alpheus then inquired, is he truly that dreadful? When Edith attempted to justify, Alpheus concurred in a general sense and asked if the young lady was prepared. From tomorrow onward, their schedules will be quite busy, so she must retire early. Edith offered a faint smile and reassured him not to fret about her. She had said this, but the queen's arrival was much grander than she could have imagined. Edith mused on the exorbitant cost of it all, observing the horses and the costly attire of the queen's entourage. When the queen turned her attention to Edith, the young lady was profoundly surprised. She courteously curtsied to the queen, stating that it was a tremendous honor for her to meet the dowager queen. Despite the queen being aware of Edith's family, she did not know the young lady's name. Therefore, she inquired about Edith's appellation. After hearing her name, Griselda remarked that it was quite lovely. Edith blushed and thanked the queen. The queen has remarked that the names Edith and Alpheus complement each other quite well. Edith and the Marquis pondered. At last, it begins. The dowager queen gazed at Edith and inquired whether the young lady felt discomfort due to her presence. Edith, smiling, replied in the negative, emphasizing that it was an immense honor for her to meet Queen Griselda. The queen expressed her desire to converse without Alpheus. Edith assured her that she was all ears. The queen stated that she presumed this news was no longer a novelty, and that Edith must have already surmised it. Or had she not? But Edith was baffled by the queen's words. After sipping her tea, the queen mentioned that Alpheus was now with Irene, or rather, Lady Russell. Lady Russell was. Edith recalled that the queen had suggested they be introduced. She had brought a few handmaidens with her, as she felt entirely ill at ease without them. Lady Spencer, Lady Russell, and Lady Doric. She referred to them as handmaidens, but it was evident that they were contenders for the role of the Marquis's bride. These handmaidens had been meticulously selected, not only in terms of age and physical charm but also their lineage. Spencer and Russell hailed from noble houses that were directly subordinate to the queen. However, Edith had never heard of the Doric family before. Undoubtedly, they were more esteemed than the Argyle family. The Marquis was undoubtedly in a disconsolate state now, as others endeavored to annul his betrothal. Edith pitied his lordship. Ignoring his own aunt, who also happened to be the queen, would be no easy feat. As for Lady Russell, Edith couldn't help but feel sorry for her. The Marquis was far too aloof for conversations with young ladies. After sipping her tea, Edith replied that she understood. She hoped Alpheus would not falter. The queen then inquired whether Edith remained unfazed. Her betrothed was presently in the company of another young lady. Edith pondered whether she should have shown any signs of jealousy. Setting her teacup aside, she stated that she was not entirely unaffected. It was, after all, Her Majesty the Queen's will. Could a young lady oppose it? The Queen then smiled and asked if Edith's equanimity stemmed solely from duty. But that was not Edith's intent. The Queen smiled and remarked that, in any case, all was well, for Edith was Lord Alpheus's betrothed. Edith turned her gaze to the next provocateur, Lady Spencer. She regarded Edith with fiery eyes, as if to demonstrate that she was no ordinary adversary. Edith apologized, explaining that she had not intended to offend the Queen. Nevertheless, the Queen assured Lady Argyle that there was no fault to be found in her boldness. Such audacity was not a vice but rather a compliment. The Queen had an affinity for strong individuals. Was that not the case? She then turned to Catherine, who stood beside Edith. Catherine, smiling at the Queen, confirmed that it was precisely as Her Majesty had said. She then cast a sidelong glance at Edith and smiled. Edith thought that this young lady was certainly not as straightforward as she appeared. The Queen stated that Edith was rather fetching, and now she viewed her differently. Afterward, smiling, she remarked that she believed it would be enjoyable. They would frequently spend time together. Catherine, smiling, cast a sidelong glance at Edith and commented that the Queen seldom uttered such words. Lady Argyle was indeed fortunate. Yet, Edith's thoughts were elsewhere. Would she ever be able to depart from this family, to forsake the accursed Rhodian lineage? After the evening tea, Edith stood alone in her chamber. She was profoundly fatigued. The tea gathering had proven to be quite taxing, yet all in all, it had not transpired as unfavorably as she had imagined. The Queen had demonstrated more loyalty than Edith had anticipated, and the lady had imparted a wealth of intriguing information. Edith found it quite enjoyable to converse on economic matters. However, one particular aspect had perplexed her. The Silver Grove hunting festival was approaching. The Queen inquired whether Edith had ever beheld the silver fox of the Rhodian forest. Lady Argyle had heard that this particular creature had first been sighted more than 2 decades ago. But in person, the young lady had never been graced with its presence. The queen then disclosed that this silver fox, while appearing exquisite and delicate, was a formidable predator. Rodion had chosen to make this creature a symbol of his lineage, as a constant reminder of his perilous nature. This fox was fierce, yet equally cunning, and undoubtedly remained concealed somewhere. Edith concurred with the queen's supposition, deeming it plausible. Nevertheless, the queen informed her that no one had ever managed to capture the silver fox. Hence, the monetary prize was consistently increasing. The queen had gone so far as to import renowned hunters from the capital. Edith, however, questioned whether the person who ultimately captured the silver fox should not hail from the Silver Grove. With a lowered gaze, the queen concurred, admitting that Edith was right. The queen was well aware of this stipulation, as it was widely acknowledged that only a denizen of the Silver Grove could accomplish this feat. After this admission, the queen fell silent. Perhaps Edith had spoken amiss. Could it be that she had misconstrued a familiar saying denoting pride in one's homeland, which had been passed down through their family for generations? Yet, the queen would not broach the subject directly. Edith heaved a sigh, and the Marquis, who was seated in the shadows, inquired about the source of her sigh, causing her considerable consternation. She asked what he was doing in her chamber. However, he furrowed his brow and suggested that she ponder it herself. Perhaps he was waiting for the mistress of the room. Yet, if the Marquis had returned, it would have been proper to greet the Dowager Queen. Then the Marquis proclaimed himself the master of the Silver Grove, while she was but a guest, and guests should not overstay their welcome. Edith, switching on the light, retorted that it would be over soon, regardless. But why was the Marquis discussing this matter with her? He replied that she had not yet given a definitive answer. No matter how often her opinion was solicited, her decision would remain unchanged. She had no intention of betrothing herself to the Marquis. Then the Marquis wished to remind her of that night they had spent together. Edith, however, exclaimed that the night did not bind them to marriage. The Marquis, with a smile, placed his hand over his lips and conveyed that she had aroused him. Was all of this not reason enough to become betrothed? Edith was profoundly disconcerted by his conduct. Then the Marquis inquired about what he should do to secure Edith's betrothal. Turning away from him, Edith inquired at what point the Marquis had actually required a bride. Initially, he had professed to have no desire for matrimony. However, he asserted that he had never evaded marriage, but rather, he spoke of a union based on calculation. Edith then questioned the precise distinction at this juncture. The Marquis explained that the distinction lay in the individual who had broached the subject of potential brides to him. It had been Edith. This concludes the first part of the retelling of this manhwa. If we can collect 500 likes on this video, there will be a continuation of this interesting story. So please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation of this manhwa.